At nightfall, a signalman informed us that the colonel, comfortable in his shelter, wanted to let our battalion have 24 hours more. But, he said, the commandant and the Capitaine Adjutant Major cried out on the telephone that that was impossible, that the exhausted men couldn't hold on anymore, etc. In the face of such energetic protests, the colonel granted our relief for the next night. The order of relief stated that once replaced, each unit had to make its way immediately back on its own to the Bois Saint-Pierre, the battalion's assembly point. At 11 at night, the liaison from the relief unit arrived. We could now head out, but we had to await our bosses, Quinzagram and the Kronprinz, who didn't seem to be in any hurry to get out of their holes while the cannonade still raged. Crouched around the shelter, making ourselves as small as we could, we were eager to go, but no one dared to leave. Some timed fuse shells exploded above our heads, and a piece of shrapnel hit my helmet. Those shells generally announced the imminent arrival of even more dangerous armor-piercing shells. The fear of this caused a couple of shadowy figures to break off from our group and disappear into the darkness. I suggested to my friend Chiffre, sprawled beside me in the same shell hole, that I had had it with the company of the commandant and his partner in crime, and was ready to head out myself. Together we took off with all the speed that our heavy loads and our state of exhaustion would allow. By following the regular route of the relief units and the work details, in 10 minutes one could be at the base of the hill, at the mill of Esnes. But at this moment all was madness. A veritable curtain of steel and fire blocked the road. The only way through was to make a long detour to avoid this monstrous avalanche of metal. My comrade, worn out and sick, let me lead the way through the darkness and obscurity, across all sorts of obstacles which blocked our way. Tree trunks, branches, shattered weapons, barbed wire defence lines, half-deserted and three-quarters filled trenches, and dead bodies everywhere. A frightful solitude reigned in these places where 20 savage combats had been contested, an unthinkable human charnel house. But we were indifferent to these horrors, thinking only of getting out of this macabre place. That wasn't easy, because we had to clamber over big bunches of barbed wire which grabbed our trousers and the tails of our greatcoats, like invisible hands grabbing us and holding us back in this hell. Sometimes we had to crawl along on our hands and our bellies to make our way through. My friend Chiffre, afflicted with chronic bronchitis and incipient asthma, huffed and puffed behind and had to stop every now and then. I used these pauses to reconnoitre a pathway ahead. Bothered by this, he called my name, fearing that I would abandon him. Of course, the howitzer shells rained down on these slopes, forcing us to throw ourselves to the ground as soon as the violent, sinister whistling announced that they were heading in our direction. To guide us in our flight, we turned our backs on the flares and rockets which marked our front line. Each step forward took us farther to the rear. There was no need for a map or a compass. It didn't matter where we ended up. Here and there appeared other shadowy figures, fugitives like ourselves seeking the road to safety. All of a sudden, an imperious voice behind us called on us to halt, and at just the right time. In the middle of a salvo of shellfire, a minute lost could be fatal, so we played deaf. After a second summons, which we also ignored, we heard the jumble of footsteps coming toward us, and suddenly someone jammed the barrel of a big revolver right under my nose, crying out in a terrible voice that if I took one more step, I'd be a dead man. Another stranger was shaking Chiffre by the collar as if to strangle him. Christ, had we run into a couple of madmen? There were plenty of examples of those who had lost their wits altogether in places like Côte 304. But I soon recognized that I had in front of me the young Sub-Lieutenant Roques of the 23rd Company, that of the Brute, the terrible Captain Barbier. Sub-Lieutenant Roques represented a common type of young officer. Brave, courageous, well-trained, but immature, play-acting, filled with pride, treating the men like children, sometimes having fun with them, but, in a quick mood swing, capable of meanness and petty vexations. In a word, just as likely to commit dramatic acts of egotism and cowardice as acts of heroism, depending on the circumstances and the amount of hooch consumed. Outraged by this highly impolite way of stopping people, I hoisted my Liebel rifle and replied to him, "You've got your revolver, I've got my rifle, so what do you want to do now?" Seeing us moving downhill at all deliberate speed, He had figured that we knew where we were going, and he had wanted us to wait for him and his orderly so that we could guide them along too. He swore, besides, that he had no intention of using his revolver on us. But just like Captain Barbier, he wanted to shoot down the first artilleryman he ran into, which he didn't do, nor would he have. Soon after that, we met up with a poilu completely draped in armour made of platters, canteens and cooking pots and pans. It was a conscientious rationer, transporting all of his cooking equipment. We were joyfully surprised to discover that this peaceable warrior was none other than our fellow Periacoa, Paul Alpec. Finally, we reached a road. We hadn't yet put quite enough space between the mouths of German cannons and our worthy selves, but here we felt at least we could breathe a little. At the end of our strength, we collapsed against the slope alongside the road. The night before, we hadn't gotten rations, and our mess kits, our canteens and our stomachs were absolutely empty. Exhausted and famished, we wondered if we'd be able to pick up the march again, when all of a sudden we sniffed the tempting aromas of coffee, of bouillon, of garlic wafting their way into our nostrils. The darkness had kept us from seeing, a short distance away, some field kitchens, awaiting in complete silence the arrival of ration teams. I immediately headed for these providential food carts. 11th Notebook, the 296th Regiment in Champagne, May 19th, July 12th, 1916. By a happy stroke of luck, these field kitchens belonged to the 142nd Territorial Regiment. A long-standing friendship united this regiment to our own, further strengthened by a winter of great danger and suffering, 1914-1915, shared in the plains and the swamps of Vermelles and Givenchy in Artois, when we were side by side. They welcomed us like brothers and offered us as much food and drink as we wanted. As for me, I wolfed down a plateful of codfish and salad, the plat du jour. These territorials definitely didn't deprive themselves of anything. While we were savouring a second quarter-litre of coffee, Sub-Lieutenant Roques sprang up, still brandishing his revolver. His state of confusion was still at an early stage. He spotted a poor devil of a rationer who was arriving loaded down with canteens and mess tins. Pouncing on him, Roques stuck his revolver right between his eyes, crying, "You're an artilleryman, aren't you? You're going to pay. Speak up. You're an artilleryman, right?" The rationer, baffled, dropped all his pots and pans, and sputtered that he was a territorial. "Well, consider yourself lucky to have gotten off so easy," said the officer to him, finally holstering his pistol and wandering off, whistling a popular tune. The territorial had to believe that he had just met a madman or a sick practical joker. The three of us from Périac, well rested, strength regained, and informed of our whereabouts by the territorials, headed down the road to the Bois Saint-Pierre. Soon we ran into some groups, or rather some disorganized gangs, from the 296th Regiment. Men from different companies were all mixed up. Each one marched, or rather dragged himself, along as best he could, stopped to rest, headed out across fields, lingered in villages he passed through. Montreville, Vigneville, Bethalenville. What a miserable picture. 7 days of insomnia, fatigue, thirst, anguish had transformed these sturdy men, these superbly disciplined companies, into ragged troops of laggards, of sickly, moribund figures, who nevertheless displayed an air of calm contentment for the joy of simply being alive. At the summit of a hill, we paused at the foot of a spring which bubbled clear, fresh water beside the road, where each passer-by paused to quench the feverish thirst which consumed him. We took one final look back at Côte 304 and the Mort Homme, which stood out in the rosy horizon of dawn. As if from two erupting volcanoes, clouds of smoke rose up from each of the two hilltops, and the flames of explosions burst forth like jets of incandescent lava. From where we stood, we could look down on our artillery batteries hidden in the nearby ravines, valleys and woods, firing away with all their guns. It shook up this whole corner of the Argonne. What did this insane bombardment signify? Were the Boches launching a fresh attack on Côte 304 and the Mort Homme? Our curiosity wasn't strong enough to make us go back and find out. A few shells landed on a nearby hill, spurring us along our way. At Bethalenville, someone showed us a connecting road which would save us a kilometre in distance. But we came upon several crossings in the road, and we couldn't pick the right one, so we had to cover at least 2 kilometers more. At the edge of the Bois de Bethelonville, we reached the main road. There was a large gathering of stragglers, and some officers were trying to regroup their units with varying degrees of success. Suddenly 2 men on horseback appeared. It was our old friends, Quince Grams and the Kronprinz. Seeing all these people in headlong flight, the Kronprinz scowled even more grimly than he usually did when he was angry. Good God, what was the world coming to if we let soldiers do what they please instead of forming up properly? It was the end of everything. Good thing we had spent so much of our rest time in close order drills, with ranks as tightly formed as he could make them. It wouldn't have surprised me if he had tried to take this shapeless mass of men in hand, as he liked to say. But he restrained himself. Meanwhile, Quince Graham, always on the lookout, scanned the 4 corners of the horizon, fearing the appearance of an enemy airplane squadron in search of prey on which to drop its murderous bombs. Despite the fact that the sky was crisscrossed not by aircraft, but only by inoffensive larks and swooping swallows, he curtly ordered us to disperse into the Bois Saint-Pierre. Like a couple of medieval knights returning from the field of combat, covered with glory, our 2 leaders, proudly mounted on their steeds, rode off at a gentle gallop, followed at a respectful distance by their aides, or should I say, their pages. To reach the Bois Saint-Pierre, the road made a big curve as far as Dombasle. I had a vivid recollection of the principle of elementary geometry, that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Applying this principle, I cut across the fields, all the while astonished that this brilliant idea had occurred to me alone. My astonishment lasted only a brief while. My 2 travelling companions had rejoined their units, one in a liaison group which arrived at the edge of the woods before we did, despite our starting out ahead of them, and the other in a core group of his company which was at the big assembly point. I was therefore travelling on my own, cheerful, unattached, free of any duties for an hour or so, taking great gulps of fresh air unpolluted of any harmful ingredients, savouring all the real and imagined liberties which made me forget how tired I was. But what was this shimmering I saw, these sparkling rays of sunshine reflected in the field ahead of me? Well, it was a big stretch of marshland which blocked my route. That's why no one else had headed across this field, except me, who considered myself more clever than anyone else. But let it not be said that any sort of marshland would halt the forward progress of a hero of Cote 304. So I pushed on resolutely, smiling at the panic of legions of toads and frogs who fled, terrified at my approach. Suddenly my forward foot got stuck in a gooey patch of thick mud. I quickly yanked it back so forcefully that I fell right into the water. Now I wasn't smiling anymore. This incident made me feel like beating a hasty retreat. It would be worth the extra effort to escape safe and sound from a frightful danger, rather than getting mired in a toad hole. But just a short way ahead, I could see the greenery of the Bois Saint-Pierre. I pressed on, not without taking some prudent measures, frequent soundings with my walking stick and numerous small detours. How bizarre Mother Nature was, I told myself, in the distribution of her treasures. In the Somme and Pas-de-Calais, you had to figure on 4 or 5 cable lengths of rope to get a bucketful of muddy water out of a well. Here in the Meuse department, there was water everywhere, and you didn't even know where it came from. Scarcity in one place, overabundance in another. It was hard to understand. What I did understand was that it took me a large number of broken zigzag lines, instead of one long straight one, which had lengthened my route considerably, before finally reaching the firmer soil of our promised land, the Bois Saint-Pierre. As I arrived, I met a poilu dragging himself along slowly, leaning on a long stick like a shepherd's crook and limping like a dog whose leg had been broken. Surprise! It was a Périacois, my friend Edouard Durand, corporal in the same section as mine. The natives of the banks of the Argent Double surely do have a hard life, but this fellow had received a blow on his knee from a stone kicked up by an exploding shell, and also had a half-dozen blisters on his feet. We had finally made it, after 12 hours or so of marching. Alongside the road, each straggler rejoined his own company, stacked his rifle, and stretched out on the mossy ground. After having unburdened myself of all the trappings of a modern warrior, I was just about to do likewise, when Lieutenant Breton, commanding our company, waved me over. I was hardly in any presentable condition, all rumpled and splattered with sticky mud from head to heels. But I had to approach my boss, expecting with utter indifference some sort of reproach on account of my tardy arrival or my sewer worker's appearance. Well, yes, sir, that's just what it was. All Lieutenant Breton wanted to do was to congratulate me immediately for my courageous conduct on Coat 304. Surprised and confused, I mumbled that I hadn't done anything extraordinary. No, he said. Lieutenant Laureus reported to me that you volunteered for a perilous reconnaissance, replacing a courier on the very day of our being relieved. Fierce anti-militarist that I was, to be congratulated as an exemplary soldier was almost as painful to me as a wound would have been. But adding it all up, for my future well-being, it would be better that my bosses had esteem and consideration for me, which would help wipe out the warnings and black marks which Commandant Leblanc and Captain Croce had amassed next to my name. A moment later, we saw a bicyclist arrive, huffing and puffing from his rapid pace, a mysterious envelope in his hand, asking for the Commandant. The latter was sitting under a big oak tree right nearby. His household staff was bustling around, setting up a splendid meal for him. The Commandant read the fatal note and stood speechless. Over his shoulder, Captain Cromerevier read it too, and made an indecipherable grimace. I could see no good coming out of any of this. There was something ominous about it. It was nothing less than an order from Colonel Douce, ordering us to take the road back to Cote 304 immediately. The Germans were once again massing for an assault, and our two front-line battalions were poorly positioned. To set out again when a quarter of the battalion hadn't arrived yet. To redo 20 kilometres under a leaden sun, with the cheerful prospect of returning to that hellhole. All this was too much. There was murmuring. Some declared that they were going to lie down and would have to be carried up there. But the great majority greeted this news with a dumb silence, apathetic, not seeming to realise the gravity of the order. The Commandant ruled that we would leave in an hour once we had eaten our supper. We ate without any appetite. Having dreamt of a restorative siesta, and now thinking that soon we would be reliving the hours of nightmare, making the superhuman effort to return to such awful places didn't do much to stimulate our appetites. Suddenly, a cloud of dust rolls down the road and stops in front of us. It clears away, and a handsome automobile appears before our eyes. On the hood and the sides are painted a square with red stripes. It's a divisional staff car, and from the door which an orderly hastens to open descends our divisional general, General Andrieux. His face radiates joy. At the sight of him, the Commandant and the Capitaine Adjutant Major interrupt their repast and rush up to their big boss, bowing and saluting, grimacing with smiles. "I bring you good news," the General calls out. "The division is relieved." Embarrassed, the Commandant puts the Colonel's message in front of him. "Oh, the devil," the General says, scratching an ear. "This is serious." He took a look at us, a look filled with pity, then got back into his car, saying, "I'm going to Corps headquarters in Bar-le-Duc. In an hour you'll be all set." This hour was, for us, an hour of anguish, the anguish of a condemned man who is awaiting his final judgment of life or death. At the end of 3/4 of an hour, we were all fixing our gazes on the dusty road bleached almost white-hot by the sun. Like Sister Anne, we saw nothing coming. The road was hopelessly deserted. Perched on an outcropping, one of us pointed out a cloud of dust in the distance which was approaching at breakneck speed. 2 or 3 minutes later, the divisional staff car pulled up a few paces from the Commandant. This time, no general. The driver, by himself, carried the precious piece of paper which contained the definitive relief order from the division. Following the ironic military expression, in an hour the fresh troops, in spite of the torrid heat that day, would be arriving, and the same vehicles which were bringing them up to the slaughterhouse would carry us away to our places of rest. The companies awaiting these providential vehicles stacked their arms at the edge of the woods. Men slumped over right on the spot, so great was their fatigue, abandoning themselves to a heavy sleep, indifferent to the scorching rays of the sun. Captain Cromerevier, catching sight of this, gave the order for everyone to get back into the woods. He made a point of browbeating those who didn't hop to it quickly enough. It was enough to melt your heart. This man, so egotistical, so hard on the others, so indifferent to suffering elsewhere, now displayed the kind attentions of a mother. The only thing missing was someone to point out how ridiculous it all was. But our siesta didn't last long. Soon the well-known whistle of the commandant was heard, and we had to hoist packs and move out. There was a moment of worry. Was this some terrible counter-order? Luckily not, but we had to go as far as a village, the name of which I didn't ask, to get to the trucks. Someone had figured out that it was better to save on a few litres of gasoline, which cost money, and instead add to our fatigue, which cost them nothing. Whoever gave this order had no thought for the amount of suffering and weariness which he was imposing on us. These several kilometres of marching opened up the scrapes and blisters on our feet, and the straps of our packs cut painful furrows in our shoulders. Finally, the liberating vehicles arrived, and disgorged onto the roadside clusters of soldiers who silently examined our cadaverous faces, our untidy uniforms, our coatings of mud, our shaggy beards, all of which made us look like highway robbers. They posed few questions as they looked at us and listened to the incessant rumbling of the cannonade in the distance. Even the stupidest among them understood where they were going and what was awaiting them. They surely envied our lot, and on our side we surely pitied them. But to each his turn, and to each his destiny. The trucks carried us off in the direction of Bar-le-Duc, which we passed through at 5 in the afternoon, nearly twilight. We saw tall smokestacks profiled on the horizon. They were the steel mills at Saint-Dizier. We halted 2 kilometres from the city, at the village of Bethencourt. The 15th Company was billeted in a dilapidated barn, largely open to the breezes and quite filthy. But it looked like a palace to us compared to our uncomfortable lodgings on Côte 304, and we enjoyed a calm and restorative sleep with no fear of falling shells. The next day, early on, General Andrieux himself came to bring us the happy news that home leaves would start up again, after having been suspended for 3 months. And that very evening the first leave-takers headed off to get the train at Saint-Dizier, to the envy of everyone else. Leaving for home was a moment of rare joy, of consolation, of happiness, awaited with feverish impatience. You forgot everything else, whether the sufferings of days just past, or the bitterness of having to return to the front. Oh, you would have to pay a high price for the poorest poilu to give up his leave. The next few days, amazingly, they left us alone. It was the first time that we could really rest and get cleaned up, which we sorely needed. In the evenings, with a couple of comrades, and despite the strict prohibition which had been set on us, I went into Saint-Dizier, an industrial city of 16,000 inhabitants. Like everywhere else in the rear, life went on calmly and peacefully, as if it were the year 2000 and Côte 304 were as far away as Mount Sinai. When I say that they left us alone, I have to make an exception for the inevitable inspections by our maniacal commandant, who couldn't find complete satisfaction and an undisturbed sleep without being assured that the latrines were properly installed, by the rules, at the minimum width and depth. What we had to eat meant nothing to him, but where we deposited the vestiges of the kitchens had, for him, a capital importance. Similarly, he couldn't sit still until he had come to check if the squad's lantern was hung on the correct crossbeam, or if a full bucket of water was at the door in case of fire. But draughts of cold air, filthiness of billets, absence of straw for sleeping, those were secondary for him. Of course, he went on his inspection tours only when he was sure that he had, for his own precious person, a comfortable lodging and a soft bed. Nevertheless, this man was more irritating than terrifying, and he inspired only a modest fear in us. The next day, after our arrival at Bethencourt, he visited the billets of the 22nd Company, followed by his shadow, the Capitaine Adjutant Major. He spotted among the soldiers a poilu in shirt-sleeves, who seemed to pay no attention to the presence of these 2 eminent personages, and who was in the process of shaving before a basin of water. Offended by this disrespectful attitude, the commandant sharply reprimanded this undisciplined fellow. He'd be sorry that he did so. The soldier was a hothead in normal circumstances, and a sore head when he was a little out of sorts, as was the case today. Insolently looking the commandant up and down, from head to toe, he lashed him with a stream of scornful phrases. "You little runt, you little ragamuffin. It's out there on the front lines that you should come visit us, and now on the first day of rest we have, you show up and bother us. On Cote 304, you didn't even dare come out of your hole. Now get out of my sight." The commandant was as stunned as if a .250 caliber howitzer shell had landed at his feet. The Capitaine Adjutant Major staggered back, clutching at the spectacles which he could barely hold onto his nose. Both raging with anger, they ordered Lieutenant Cordier to immediately draw up disciplinary charges against this rebel, and then departed, no doubt wondering if this unprecedented act wasn't one of the signs of the end of the world, which the Holy Scriptures describe so vividly in terms of abomination and desolation. The outcome was that Lieutenant Cordier, in all good conscience, wrote up a report about this soldier, emphasizing the courage he had shown on Cote 304 at every opportunity, always volunteering for the most perilous missions and positions. The commandant was floored. "I asked for a list of charges," he said, "and you give me the text for a medal citation." "I'm just telling the truth," Lieutenant Cordier replied with vigour, and the soldier got out of it with no punishment at all. The next day, the two inseparable striped sleevers scoured the main streets of the village of Bethencourt, assuring themselves that their prescriptions for good order, proper attire, etc. were being observed, and that their assignments to the sentries were being carried out to the letter. There had, of course, been patrols and rounds carried out as part of this surveillance, but as time passed they could be sure only by checking for themselves, first-hand. Grave and serious, they arrived in front of the town hall, where the police station was located. At the door was a sentry, who was none other than the sometime Periaquois Sabatier, he who had been both buried and exhumed by shells on Cote 304. He was worrying deeply about when he could next treat his gullet to a bottle of wine or beer. The battalion's two big shots passed in front of him, and cast a blatant look at his greatcoat, where 3 buttonholes were empty of buttons, and at his trousers covered with rips, still splattered with the glorious mud of Cote 304. But the two officers stopped short, dumbstruck. The insolent Sabatier hadn't seen the need to take his pipe out of his mouth, a brand new pipe, the old one having been blasted to bits and torn from his mouth up there by a shell's blast. That was already a grave misstep for a sentry. But the imprudent Sabatier took things even further, to the crime of lèse-majesté, by not saluting his bosses with his rifle. He took no more notice than if the village constable had strolled past. This was too much. Violated discipline required vengeance. The commandant approached the guilty party and severely demanded, "Since when do you not pay your respects?" Without rousing himself, Sabatier stretched his arms out toward the sun, which was hiding behind a cloud, and called out in a booming voice, "Oh, sorry, the sun has gone down." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that on Cote 304 we never saw you. Here we don't salute anymore." This incoherent language was perfectly clear to our two partners, who fled as if they'd been slapped. The lowliest, most ignorant private was reproaching them for the cowardice they had shown on Cote 304. It was long ago that they had lost the esteem of their men. Now they had earned their scorn. From that point on, Commandant Quinsgrams, his dignity wounded as deeply as it could be, shrunk from our view and soon would leave us. He lost all his appetite. In vain did our friend Richardis, yet another Periaquois. They wormed their way in everywhere who took care of the gastronomic needs of the two partners, draw upon all of his extensive knowledge of the culinary arts. In vain did he outdo himself in the preparation of sauces and cakes, applying the precious secrets which contributed to the lofty reputation of the Hôtel Richardis in Périac. In vain did he conjure up aromas which would have tempted the nostrils of the most demanding gourmets. Quinsgram, faced with these treasures of the table, made a frown which pulled his mouth farther and farther down on his face, and with a voice which came out of his nose, said disdainfully, "Is this what there is? I don't want any. Give me a soft-boiled egg." The cooking, seasoning and presentation of this egg weren't handed off to the first dishwasher who came along. So Vatel Richardis, in person, watched over the boiling of the egg to the exacting tastes of quince grams, and made sure that no more or no fewer than the precise number of centigrams of salt went onto it. His comrade, the Kronprinz, didn't lose his appetite over so small a matter. He eagerly devoured both his portion and that of quince gram. Meanwhile, what had happened to the regiment's 2 other battalions, left in the furnace of Verdun? The most alarming rumours were spreading, and they turned out to be true. On May 23rd, the debris of these 2 battalions joined us at Bethencourt. I watched their lamentable parade, and I noted the almost complete disappearance of the 24th, 23rd and 19th companies, where there were hardly any men left, except those who hadn't been up on the front lines. In other companies, the sections were reduced to the size of a squad. What had happened after we left? From the soldiers of various companies whom I questioned, it was difficult to come up with an exact indication, but what was clear was that after furious bombardments, the Germans had attacked in compact bunches and occupied some of our trench lines, capturing or massacring the occupants. The skin of our commandant must have crawled at the news that the Germans had gotten as far as the shelter where he had been. Stretcher-bearers, telephone operators and orderlies had all pitched in, keeping the enemy back with volleys of grenades. There was desperate resistance by certain units, and acts of true heroism which broke the efforts of the assailants. Therefore, at assembly on May 24th, there was an avalanche of congratulations, and we heard many statements like this one. Regiment of brave men who preferred to be chopped to pieces right there, rather than yielding an inch of ground. To future newcomers to the 296th Regiment, to whom they will keep repeating these fine phrases, they'll hold back from telling them that the poor devils who were there, those brave men, could do nothing else but stay there. For any who would have been tempted to save themselves, there would have been a firing squad. There was naturally a cascade of croix de guerre distributed, as always, according to the whims of the officers, who began by giving them to each other. For these, the company commanders had to present a list of those most deserving. Lieutenant Cordier responded with these noble words: "All my men did their duty. To reward a few would be to do an injury to the others. That's an injustice to which I will not subscribe." One can understand that Lieutenant Cordier, by manifesting such independence of heart and character, was far from being in good standing with the 2 ridiculous dictators of our battalion, who avenged themselves upon him and his company by petty vexations. By reliable intelligence, I learned that the total number of killed, wounded and missing from the regiment went as high as 1,050. That, it seemed, was sufficient for us not to be sent up to the front again. I truly believe that with one more week we would all have stayed there forever. Not one periaqua had even a scratch. You would have said that a mysterious hand had protected them. But what hand? On May 24th, we were duly informed at assembly that field exercises would be starting up again. Wasn't it urgent that this dangerous spirit of indiscipline which was starting to manifest itself be checked? To bring everyone back to a strict conception of his duties, there was surely nothing like a few sessions of bayonet drill, of basic training singly and by section, supplemented by a few excursions across rugged terrain, from which one would return with shirts dripping with sweat. Commandant Quince Grams had already drawn up a training program in which not one paragraph, one article, one subsection of theory had been left out. We'd get something out of it. We were being treated like raw recruits. But the next day, rather than heading out onto the training ground, we had to get ready to depart. An order which came from the mysterious and invisible high reaches of headquarters enjoined the 296th Regiment to embark for an unknown destination. We had to leave Bethencourt by 6 in the evening. We all thought this meant embarking at the Saint-Dizier station, right nearby, but to our stupefaction we took the opposite direction. The route that we took looped its way across countryside rich in vegetation, fields with a variety of crops filled with fruit trees. Grapevines lined the road, but most of us were insensitive to the beauties of the landscape, and we paid more attention to a gathering of menacing clouds, which ended up unleashing a terrible downpour upon us. And still we marched. We passed through several villages. Night was falling. Where were they leading us? At about 10 in the evening, we arrived in a pitiable state at a station, that of Yeovil. They left us by the side of the road, soaked with sweat and rain. Then we loaded onto trains. The officers in first or second-class carriages, we as usual in cattle cars, packed so tightly that we had to take turns sitting down. I spent half the trip holding onto a ring which hung from a crossbeam, just to keep my balance. At one stop, I read on the station sign, through the slats, Saint-Dizier. So they had imposed upon us a long, hard march, soaking us to the skin, having us stand shivering for 2 hours at night in front of a station in the middle of nowhere just to come back to Saint-Dizier. Who gave this idiotic order? Who burdened us with these wearying and useless sufferings? There's a lawful punishment for whoever beats an animal with brutality. But there is no sanction, no punishment. There is complete impunity for these jerks for whom we serve as toys, as punching bags. 1916. Commandant Leblanc's misadventure. Cupely, Vadonay, the camp at Chalons. We passed by Vitry-le-François, and at daybreak we went through Chalons-sur-Marne. At the station at Saint-Hilaire there was a brief halt. Commandant Leblanc took advantage of it and went to the toilet. Was he constipated? Or did he linger to examine these restrooms, a subject about which he was very knowledgeable? I can't set straight anyone who reads these lines, but the outcome was that when Quince Graham stepped back onto the station platform, our train had disappeared. At the station at Cupely, they had us get out of the train. This was the end of an ordeal. Now we could relax our arms and legs, loosen up our shoulders and our flanks, after 12 hours of being piled up in cattle cars too small for the number of men they contained. This was a great relief, a blessing. It's true that a fine, thick rain was falling, and that the wait in front of the station, with arms stacked, really lasted a bit too long. What were we doing there anyway, instead of proceeding to our next encampment? Well, the reason was that the commandant alone knew where our battalion had to be. He was stuck in the lavatories back at the Saint-Hilaire station, and he had to arrive in order to reveal to us the site of our next billet, a secret which he had kept to himself like a state secret, which he had not revealed even to our friend François Calvet, the battalion's adjutant, nor to His Eminence Grise, Captain Croix-Merivier. When the news of his misadventure spread through the battalion, it brought on a general outburst of laughter. He himself arrived sooner than we thought he would, brought by an automobile which a providential fate carried to Cupely. Almost immediately, the bleating of a hoarse goat was heard. It was the whistle of Quince Graham giving the signal for departure. A half-hour later, we took possession of our barracks, hidden away in the clearings of a forest of stunted pines. A road from Cupely to La Chepe and a river, the Noblette, cut across our encampment. What the hell? It was in this place of exile that we had come to rest on our laurels. We, whose glory, according to what the newspapers said, eclipsed that of all the heroes whose exploits history had recorded. One would have had to be leprous, scabrous, vermin-ridden, to be put in quarantine, to be driven to a place as isolated, as desolate, as rude as this was. It's true that we should have been flattered to find ourselves in the place where, it seems, the terrible Attila was crushed after a horrendous battle 1,000 years ago. But human ingratitude is such that no memorial, not even a stone, recalled the memory of this battle where the fate of our nation was played out. As for comfort in the aforementioned barracks, they left much to be desired. For bedsteads, rough planks trampled over all day long by our muddy feet. For pillows, our packs. It's a good thing that our shoulders and our sides were toughened. We would have appreciated an armful of fresh straw upon which to rest our sore bodies. But at this time, straw was a luxury which only officers could afford, and the horses of officers. One day at assembly, a whole panoply of heroes was rewarded with a profusion of decorations and sleeve stripes of every variety. I was named a corporal, once again. That left me completely indifferent. But since the stripes were given to me in defiance of the wishes of the commandant and the capitaine adjutant major, I could only rejoice at their annoyance. They gave me command of the 6th Squad, a phantom squad, consisting of 1 barber, 1 drummer, 1 orderly, and other staff employees whom you saw only at mealtimes. The only man fit for combat duty and who showed up with me at inspections and drills was a school teacher named d'Artigues. He never offered any excuses, and was as unerringly phlegmatic as any son of England. His face manifested an attitude so stupid that it sometimes disconcerted and disarmed our section chief, Adjutant Toulzan, who thought him hopeless. Once he had swallowed his meal, our pedagogue disappeared as if by magic, and then at roll calls and departures he would reappear at the last minute. But in what attire? Puttees undone and falling around his ankles, in greatcoat when he was supposed to be in jacket, and vice versa. His cap stuck on his head like a nightcap when the others wore helmets, his necktie twisted to the side, his pack with its straps going every which way, from which blanket, mess tins, billy cans, tools, all hung down, hooked and roped on just enough so that they wouldn't fall off. Chewed out by the adjutant, he was sent back morning and night by the corporal or the sergeant on duty. His name was always at the top of the work-duty roster, but he led a taciturn existence, indifferent to everyone and everything, living apart from his comrades. Had the war clouded his brain? Was he a poker face making fun of us all? Was he a philosopher whose spirit soared in realms inaccessible to common mortals, and whose body was simply vegetating here on earth? What a mystery. As you might well imagine, the field exercises had begun again. Watch out when you were under the orders of Lieutenant Groulois, nicknamed Gueule de Bois. He led us to a large clearing in the woods where the sections trained separately. There was no point trying to fool around with this jail warden of a lieutenant. From the shade of a pine tree he kept us all in his sight, and no false movement or faulty order escaped his notice. At a signal, a whistle blast from him, a movement or a command had to be done over and over again until it was perfect. It was my turn to take command of the section. D'Artigues, always either distracted or not paying attention, sometimes understood a complicated change of direction or an assembly, but I always ended up no better or no worse than anyone else. This was a relief whenever the lieutenant said, "Someone else take charge." You couldn't ask to be knocked back down in rank. One day, the regiment received a reinforcement of 200 men from the conscript class of 1916. What an aberration, to pour such young folks into a regiment in which many of us were 35 to 40 years old and more. The 296th Regiment indeed became an active duty, regular regiment. Maybe they thought that the insouciance, the innocence, the enthusiasm of these young ones would shake off the apathy and the inertia of US veterans, just like a bar owner pours a bucket of new wine into a cask of old stale wine to refresh it. During the night of May 30th, 31, we had a visitor whom we would have gladly missed. A Boche pilot flew his airplane over and dropped some bombs on the camp. Thanks to his clumsiness, there were no victims. On June 1st, the battalion left the camp and went to billets in Cupoli, just a few kilometres away. We were finally returning to civilization. We spent all day setting up, hastily digging deep latrines in anticipation of the inevitable visit of Quinze Graham. But all was in vain. The next day, without knowing why or how, we moved 3 kilometres to the village of Vadonay. We got, from a dozen different garrison towns, reinforcements in batches of 20, 30, 40 men, and the regiment was quickly brought back to strength. We thought we'd enjoy a nice long rest, but on June 5th we got the unhappy news that the next day, at 6 in the morning, we were heading up to the trenches. After a march of 4 hours across an arid plain which was none other than the Camp de Chalons, we arrived at 10 in the morning at the little town of Sweep, completely abandoned by its inhabitants. Many of the houses were still intact, but once in a while bombs from airplanes or shells from howitzers would blast one of them to bits. Only a few slackers occupied the town. Our company was billeted, or rather stuffed, in 2 tight quarters. We complained, but they stopped our complaints by kindly alerting us that we would, that very evening at 8 o'clock, get to know our new sector, which we reached around midnight, dead tired. The sector was calm, and compared to Côte 304, it was a vacation spot. But what spoiled the pleasure of occupying this peaceful sector was that it had recently seen a poison gas attack, which had claimed many victims, and we feared another attack. We were going to live or die with this nightmare. Our section being in reserve, we occupied deep shelters with 2 entrances, which made us ecstatic. This was the first time we had seen anything like this. Inside them, nothing to fear from bombardments, but it wasn't the same for that accursed gas. We had no more than mediocre confidence in the precautions taken. At the entrances of each shelter, there was a stick of wood, some straw, and some gasoline, to be lit in order to dissipate the murderous cloud. There were special grenades to disperse the gas by their explosions, exploding canisters full of water with bisulfite to make the gas cling to the ground. But it wasn't enough to have these things there. What was needed was a detailed organization, with each of us having an assignment to carry out in an emergency. We should have been paying attention to the upkeep and the readiness of all these items. In reality, only the officers who consistently occupied the same shelters could take such useful precautions. The sections changed positions every night or two, so that the men had no taste for keeping themselves ready for a gas attack at any moment. So the water went stale in its containers, the canisters rusted and became unusable, the powdered bisulfite disappeared, the gasoline was used by the poilus to light up their shelters, the wood and the straw got soaked in the rain and the dew. Nobody knew, in case of a gas attack, just what we needed to do and where to hide ourselves away in the shelters. Everything was left to chance. All we could do was put ourselves into the hands of Boreas, the god of the winds, in hopes that he would favour us. To do so, at each shelter or outpost, the clever poilus had installed tiny windmills to serve as weather vanes. When a light breeze blew across the champaign, we observed the movements of these little windmills with no less concern than a sailor watches the needle of his barometer move toward or away from the word stormy. But after a few days we got used to this danger, like all the others, and we didn't attach any more importance to it than we did to an imaginary danger. The next night our half-section went up to the front line to reinforce the outposts, which were manned by squads of no more than 3 or 4 unlucky men, always the same ones obliged to be on watch night and day, almost without interruption. For some reason or other, 2/3 of the effective strength of the companies had been exempted from outpost duty and assigned to the rear. Around the command posts of commandants and captains, you'd see more and more strapping young fellows carrying out vague functions. Orderlies, cooks, aides, signalmen, rationers, tailors, barbers, etc., all bowing and scraping before the officers. These new noblemen of the 20th century, who in exchange pulled them out of the first circle of this new Dante's Inferno, the trenches. With my squad of 3 men, including the taciturn, mysterious D'Artigues, I could do no more than reinforce an outpost occupied by a squad of 2 men. The night before, a shell had scored a direct hit on this outpost, wounding 5 occupants, 1 mortally. Thus, we were not very reassured to be occupying this outpost, so evidently targeted by the Boche artillerymen. But whether out of humanity or in order to conserve ammunition, they left us alone this night and the next several. On June 15th, at 3 a.m, a battalion of our regiment came to relieve us, and after a 4-hour march, we encamped in barracks called the Ferme de Piment, in the camp, or rather the desert of Châlons. Our rest was brief. On June 20th, at 8 p.m, we were marched up to the trenches to carry out some work upon which an impenetrable mystery hung. They split us up as we got close to the front lines, in the middle of a pine forest called the Bois des Chenilles. I don't know why, because I never saw one specimen of this creature there. The next night, with 3 sturdy comrades, I was ordered to put myself at the disposal of the railway station at Chenilles. This station, in a clearing 800 metres from the front line, was filled with all sorts of entrenching materials brought up every night by the narrow-gauge Decauville trains. But the locomotive prudently stayed at one station farther up the line, and the freight cars were hauled up at great effort by some thin and skeletal horses. The Chenilles station chief, a big-bellied slacker who never left his lair, had plenty to say to everyone in full voice, gesticulating with an air of importance no way inferior to that of station chiefs in the biggest stations in Paris. He chewed me out because I was late, and didn't let us go until around midnight without paying us a simple thank you. The weather was stormy, the night terribly dark, and in our haste to get to our shelter before the menacing downpour, we got lost in a maze of footpaths. I remembered the story of Petit Poucet, and climbed up a pine tree not to see if there was a light on the horizon, but so that the line of luminous flares would give me the general direction of north. We renewed our march on tiptoes. I was at the front of the line, which doesn't have any particular merit, but which explains my great surprise and terror when two harsh and ominous voices roared out, "Halt right there! Qui vive? Who goes there?" And as lightning flashed, I saw the points of two menacing bayonets advancing toward my chest. At a second flash, I saw two faces as black as the finest ebony, but hardly reassuring. So there were man-eaters, cannibals, in the Bois de Chenil, right in the middle of Champagne. "Comrades," I cried out, "we aren't Boche. Please let us pass." Ah, yes, let us pass. That's all we needed to say to not be skewered on bayonets. But we had to take the long way around. After some discussion among themselves, these blacks who spoke French so well told us that they were from Martinique. There were quite a number of them in the regiment next to ours, and they were able to give us helpful directions for getting back to our shelters. Our shelters, where each of us had a wire mesh bunk, an innovation which seemed to us an unaccustomed luxury. The supplier of that wire mesh yet another one who will make his fortune. The war is not an equally cruel scourge to everyone. The next night they sent us up to the front line to help with some mysterious works. It consisted of digging shallow, projecting trenches with no more than 2 or 3 steps at the end. You didn't need to be a wizard to figure out that these were shelters for preparing an emission of asphyxiating gas. Soon this was Polichinelle's secret, and everyone added to it. We were going to launch these gases along the whole Champagne front. The gases we had launched up to now were nothing but simple insecticides, but these new ones would strike down the Boches to a depth of 20 kilometers. Already in each regiment they were forming teams of courageous men to go explore, after the emission, the places where this breath of doom had passed. Special gas masks would be issued to them at Sweeps, Mourmelon and Chalons, and experiment after experiment would be carried out on the harmfulness of the gases and on the effectiveness of the gas masks. Near to the shelter where I was working, some of the Martiniquais were standing guard at the parapets. They displayed a silent and melancholy air, distracted, their spirits far, far away, no doubt across the immense ocean. I interrogated some of them to get to know their state of mind. They had hardly any martial spirit, these poor devils shivering in the chill of night-time. They had been infused with hatred of the Germans, and they were persuaded that if we were conquered, their own land would be prey to the Germans, and they would fall into a frightful slavery. They therefore accepted their fate as inevitable. Their brains had been stuffed to make cannon fodder out of them. One night, returning from work, we found the shelter surrounded by 30 or so very young men volunteers, or forced conscripts from the classes of 1917 and 1918, not yet called up. Skinny, beardless, and with insolent looks and talk full of the cheekiness of a Parisian Gavroche, these were what they called seasoned guys, despite the fact that some of them had the faces of girls or of kids of 15. Some came right out of reform school. Others, as delivery boys, had neglected to hand over to their bosses some money from a client. Some, employed by the post office, had had the indiscretion to peek into the content of private letters. One of them had found nothing better to do than to kidnap a young miss of 14, whose folks didn't want to give her to him in marriage. Finally, there were those who, young as they were, had been convicted as pimps, and they proudly showed off the letters, packages, and money which their faithful hens sent to them. To these kids precocious in vice, they had opened the prison gates in exchange for enlistment for the duration of the war. This was offered as a form of rehabilitation. In reality, it was a strange deal. To pardon them for stealing, they sent them out to kill. How's that for restoring the soul? Among them were a number of unfortunate orphans who, to free themselves from the tutelage of public assistance, had enlisted. They had been snared, dazzled by life on the front lines as depicted in the newspapers, and now they came to live out fantastic adventures and gather up stripes and medals with ease. All these recruits were assigned to the 15th Company, and a sergeant, list in hand, presented me with a dozen of these hard cases, whose corporal I now became. The barber, the drummer boy, the signalman, etc., and the enigmatic D'Artigues were taken away from me to reinforce some other squad. I furrowed my brow at this news. Why had they chosen me to command this young band of budding Apaches? They'd bring me nothing but bad luck, all sorts of nasty surprises. Did they take me for a firm-handed type? And were they counting on my toughness to bring them to heel? We'll see what happens. For now, having escaped the severe discipline of a penal battalion, they acted astonished to be at the front, almost right on the front lines, and they sang and danced with an almost childlike joy, to the bafflement of their indulgent elders. Let me hasten to say that these young rascals always treated me with respect, and I'd even dare to say affection. It's true that I didn't use a rough manner. I reprimanded them as a comrade, as an older brother, rather than as a superior in rank. I took an interest in their fates, writing applications for charity awards for these disinherited ones, and I succeeded in finding marraine de guerre for them, or getting grants allocated to them. And these poor little guys, many of whom would have only me to weep over their deaths, in exchange for my solicitude to them, took on a true and touching attachment for me. Meanwhile, the works having been completed, we left the Bois de Chenil during the night of June 29th, 30, and after a long march we came to our billets in Cupoli. This wasn't a rest period for us. From dawn to dusk we had nothing but long exercises, manoeuvres and marches in a withering heat. It made us miss the trenches. This pounding and bashing came at the orders of the firm-handed colonel sent to the 296th Regiment, it was said, to shape us up, or to get us back into shape, because evidently someone had noted a slippage of discipline in the regiment. This was Colonel Robert. This terrible fellow stuck his nose into everything, watching, surveying first-hand to make sure that the numerous rules he issued each day at roll call were being observed. What bothered him most of all was seeing the tail flaps of our uniform coats even a centimetre out of place when they were folded back. Even if you were a hero, brave as could be, or as smart as anyone, you were nothing but an idiot, a good-for-nothing, if you showed too much of the pocket underneath the flap. He rushed up to companies leaving for or coming back from exercises just for this kind of inspection. In preparation, our officers and non-coms spent every day making sure everything was just right. You'd have thought we had a lunatic, a maniac, a nutcase in charge. We wondered what he would do with us once we got up to the front lines, back to my new squad of hooligans, brawlers, troublemakers, thinking mainly about having a good time at someone else's expense. They were hungry as young wolves and poor as church mice, so I had to scramble to get them extra bread rations from some mess corporals of my acquaintance. My Périac buddies, Richardis and Maisonneuve, who were cooks at the officers' and non-coms mess, gave me a heads up when there were some leftovers in the kitchen, or a platter or casserole to scrape off. I had to make small advances or loans against their meagre pay to buy a bottle of wine or some writing paper or other small items. On July 4th, a tragic accident took place in Cupoli. At daybreak, a horse-drawn artillery wagon with 5 gunners riding on it was crossing the railroad tracks when a passenger train arrived at exactly the same time and smashed the wagon and its squad to bits. 3 of the poor devils were horribly injured and died almost immediately. 2 others were gravely hurt. That same day, wrapped in tent cloth, the 3 dead artillerymen were buried without any ceremony to speak of. These weren't heroes who died on the field of honour in the little cemetery which surrounds the church. This accident went almost unnoticed. We were hardened against any emotion. We cared only about our own fates. War is the best teacher of egoism, but tragedy for some is often profitable for others. Thanks to this sad accident, my 12 young brigands could finally satisfy their appetites. The dead horses were cut up by the butcher Jalabert from my old squad, and the meat was distributed to the companies. My pal Jalabert secretly passed along to me for the 15th squad a platter and 2 haversacks full of pieces of meat from the choicest cuts. Imagine how my young brigands jumped with joy at the promise of such a feast. We unanimously decided to transform this meat into savoury steaks, cooked nice and rare. We passed the hat to buy some oil. In a skillet without a handle, which someone found by lucky chance, a choice slab of meat was soon grilling away, letting off an aroma which flared the nostrils of the ravenous and impatient customers. One of them poked the steak with the point of his knife to see how it was cooking, and knocked over the skillet. The slice of meat fell into the fire and was transformed into a hunk of coal in less time than it takes to tell the tale. There was a howl of rage against this clumsy fellow, and if I hadn't intervened right away, he would have gotten quite a lesson for having been in more of a hurry than the others. But that was just a brief delay. 8 times the skillet was loaded with meat and its contents swallowed down as soon as it was cooked. The fellows were finally satisfied, which they hadn't been in quite a long while. Right at this time, a complete reorganization took place in all the infantry regiments. The battalions were reduced to 3 rifle companies. The 4th company of each battalion was dissolved and replaced by a machine gun company. The dissolved company's men were dispersed into the other 3 companies. All that to explain that my Pariac buddy Paul Alpech came into my company and my squad. This valuable reinforcement was just enough to bring some good order among our hooligans, always ready to quarrel and exchange blows with each other. Good old Alpech was designated the squad's cook, because while we were at rest, the field kitchens were also resting, and we were on our own for food. Alpech was the classic type of cook, and he brought to the exercise of his culinary functions an importance and a solemnity which you couldn't help but notice. Back from exercises at the end of the day, the famished gang rushed to the patch of ground where the cooking pot bubbled away on 2 big rocks, and everyone dipped his bread into it, under pretext of seeing how the bouillon was cooking, to the great despair of Alpech, who threatened to throw off his apron. Granted the widest powers by me, he armed himself with a fishing rod, which earned a respectful fear from the rascals once it had whipped the ears of a few of them. One day, at assembly, the sergeant major read out, "The 15th Company will designate a corporal to go on a training assignment to learn about the new trench cannon." The prospect of getting out of Colonel Roberts' clutches for a few days could only inspire the enthusiasm of the company's 16 corporals and cause them to raise their hands, both hands. But in vain did the Sergeant Major and Lieutenant Breton repeat the demand. None of the corporals budged. The reason was that 6 months earlier, a corporal had gone off on a training assignment for the crapouillots, trench mortars. But when he came back, he stayed a foot soldier, just like before. All he got was the nickname Crapouillot, which made him mad as hell. New to the 15th Company, I didn't know this, and I shot my hand up into the air. What worse could happen to me? 2 days later, along with a dozen privates, corporals and sergeants, I headed off to the Ferme de Bouy, the training centre for the 4th Army, where they would reveal to us the secrets of this brand new engine of destruction. The Ferme de Bouy is only 6 kilometres from Cupoli, right in the middle of the Camp de Chalon. In peacetime, it was a horse farm for remount stallions, but today it was a centre for perfecting all kinds of legal ways to kill people, to cut them down more quickly, in the largest possible number, all to save civilization from peril. Grenadiers came there to learn from crazy Captain B how to toss grenades fast and far. Bomb throwers, snipers, machine gunners came in teams to the Ferme de Bouy to spend 10 or 12 days. This made the place a slacker's haven for instructor officers and non-coms, and their entourages of orderlies, aides, cooks, messengers, secretaries, etc. There was a whole garrison there, the divisional squadron, resting up for the last great day of the final pursuit, or the triumphal entry of our general as his escort into Strasbourg or Berlin. The very evening of our arrival, I went into the village of Bouy with my comrades, and there I saw Russian soldiers for the first time. They occupied the neighbouring sector, took their rest in the nearby village of Mourmelon, and in spite of the strict prohibitions given to them, they wandered around the area in the evenings. There was an order given in the region, prohibiting their being served any alcoholic beverages, including the sacred pinard.